This is part 1 of the Chapter 6 lecture notes. Chapter 6 is on the skeletal system, but the reason that we are only doing one chapter this week is because this chapter also includes not only the bones but the muscles. Sorry. Not only the bones but the joints, not the muscles. That would be chapter 7. Okay, so the components of the skeletal system include the bones and also the cartilages, joints, ligaments, connective tissue that stabilizes or connects the bones. All of that is included as well, and that again is the reason why this chapter is longer. So it's really like having 2 chapters. Okay, the functions are support. In other words, we think of the bones a lot of times as the attachment for the muscles, so that the bones provide support for the muscular system. Storage of minerals and lipids. We know that bones store calcium and phosphorus ions, and the yellow bone marrow stores lipids or fats. Blood cell production. The red bone marrow produces all of the cells of the blood, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, which are fragments of blood cells. Protection. For example, we have the skull that protects the brain and the ribs that protect the heart and the lungs. And then leverage. Again, bones provide bones are the levers against which the muscles apply their force. So that causes us to be able to move our body. So the 5 primary functions of the skeletal system, make sure that you can name them. And then we're going to talk about bone tissue. We talked about bone tissue a little bit in chapter 4, but we're going to move on and talk about it a little bit more. We know it's a type of connective tissue. And connective tissue has cells that are surrounded by a matrix, which is fibers and ground substance. Okay, so that defines connective tissue. So the cells of bone are called, they always start with the prefix osteo. So they would be osteoblast, osteocytes, osteoclast. The mature bone cells are called osteocytes. Osteo means bone and cyte means cell. So osteocyte means mature bone cell. The matrix contains calcium phosphate and other calcium salts, but this is primarily the calcium salt that is found in bone is calcium phosphate, and that accounts for almost 2/3 of the weight of bone tissue. And so that would be the ground substance. And then there are extracellular protein fibers, and about 1/3 of the weight of bone comes from these collagen fibers. All right, the classifying of bones is done by shape. Long bones are going to be, for example, the bones of the arms and the legs. Short bones are going to be bones like the wrist and the ankle bones. Flat bones are going to be very thin, so the skull bones are flat bones. Irregular bones are going to be like the vertebrae. And then here's a picture of the different types of bones based on their shape. We are going to study the features or characteristics of a long bone. You also have to label a long bone in your lab this week. The central shaft of the long bone is called the diaphysis, and this is where you find the marrow cavity or medullary cavity. Here's a typo. This is bone marrow, sorry. So the marrow cavity or medullary cavity and the bone marrow is found within that cavity. The epiphyses are the ends of the long bone, and they're expanded. They're much wider and bulkier, and they are covered with, the bone tissue is covered with cartilage, and that cartilage is called articular cartilage because an articulation is a joint. So this is cartilage that covers bone at a joint. And by the way, remember we learned there are 3 types of cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most common, most familiar type. And this articular cartilage that covers the ends of long bones is hyaline cartilage. Hyaline. Hyaline cartilage. The other two types were elastic cartilage and fibrocartilage, but the articular cartilage that covers the ends of long bones is hyaline cartilage. So let's look at the long bone. You're going to have to label this for your lab assignment this week. All right, so the expanded ends are the epiphyses. So here's this epiphysis is called the proximal epiphysis of the humerus because it is the closest to the shoulder joint. And the distal epiphysis is the one that is closest or furthest away from the shoulder joint, but it's also closest to helps to form the elbow joint. So the two ends of the long bone are called epiphyses. They are lined on the ends with articular cartilage, as you can see here. They are composed primarily of spongy bone, which has air holes in it and is more lightweight. And then you will also find an epiphyseal line right along here in a grown person. Sorry it went out so far, but anyway, that line forms when the bone stops growing. Okay, so it starts out as cartilage and it's called an epiphyseal plate, but as the bone stops growing, it fills in with bone tissue and it's an epiphyseal line. So if you ever see an epiphyseal line in a bone, that means that is an adult bone. Then in the diaphysis, you have the marrow cavity, which is lined with spongy bone, but it is primarily composed of compact bone. As you can see on the edges, the diaphysis is primarily composed of compact bone. And then the outer lining of the bone is called the periosteum, and the inner lining is called the endosteum. All right, outer surface of bone is the periosteum. It has an inner layer that is composed of bone cells that produce new bone tissue, and then an outer fibrous layer. The outer layer of the periosteum attaches to tendons and ligaments. Remember, tendons connect muscle to bone and ligaments connect bone to bone. The inner surface of the marrow cavity is called the endosteum, and it is composed of spongy bone. The two types of tissue are compact bone and spongy bone, and sometimes spongy bone is called cancellous bone. Okay, bone tissue, compact bone tissue is formed from units of bone called osteons. And this is a picture of an osteon under a microscope. The osteon contains bone cells called osteocytes. And they would be found, I don't see where they're labeled in this picture. Hold on. Here, we can go to this picture, and you can see that it's not labeled in this picture either. Okay, well then I will show you. Every one of these little thin, tapering, dark cells is an osteocyte that resides in it's like a space or a house called a lacuna. So each osteocyte or bone cell resides inside of a space called a lacuna, and then that lacuna is surrounded by bone tissue. And the bone tissue forms layers around this central canal, and each layer of bone tissue is called lamellae. All right, so bone cells are called osteocytes. They're located within lacuna. And then sheets of bone tissue or layers of bone tissue are called lamellae. And you also see these little lines, these little teeny tiny lines that are found within the lamellae. They're called canaliculi. They are small channels that allow for nutrients and waste to be passed through from the osteocytes to the central canal. between the central canal and the osteocytes, basically. Because they are surrounded by bone matrix, which is very, very hard material, the canaliculi allow for the blood to carry nutrients and waste, nutrients to the osteocytes and waste away from them. So a basic functional unit of bone is called the osteon. And we talked about how an osteon is composed of a central canal surrounded by layers of bone tissue called lamellae. And then there are also perforating canals. If you look at the tissue in cross-section the long way, you can see that there are blood vessels that go down through the canal, kind of like a straw. And then there are blood vessels that go perpendicular through that bone tissue and connect with the blood vessels of the central canal. And so these canals that are perpendicular are called perforating canals. You can also see really well in this picture, you can see this is an osteon. You can see how the osteons are arranged with bone tissue that comes in and fills in the gaps. And you can see the spongy bone that lines the inside of the osteons, or of the compact bone. Okay. Compact bone covers all bone surfaces except inside joint capsules. Spongy bone doesn't have osteons, but the bone is arranged into rods or plates called trabeculae. The bone marrow in spongy bone, all that bone marrow that fills in the spaces is red bone marrow. So this is where the cells of the blood are formed. The reason for spongy bone is that it's much lighter than compact bone, and it does reduce the weight of the skeleton. If all we were composed of was compact bone, it would be very, very difficult for us to even lift our arms or move our legs or even breathe. The types of bone cells, we've already talked about osteocytes, which is here in the middle. Osteoblasts are bone cells that produce new bone tissue. So you find a lot of osteoblasts where bone tissue is being formed, and that process is called ossification. What they do is the osteoblasts secrete the bone matrix, and after they're surrounded by bone matrix, they change into osteocytes. So osteoblasts are the precursors to osteocytes. Osteocytes are mature bone cells, and then osteoclasts do the opposite of osteoblasts. They actually secrete acid and enzymes that dissolve bone matrix, and the minerals are then reabsorbed or resorbed back into the blood. So this should let you know that bone tissue is always being remodeled. It's always being broken down and rebuilt. One reason is because when we do need the minerals that are found in the bone, when our blood does need those minerals, osteoclasts can break down the bone and the minerals can be released into our blood, and that's called resorption. And if we have too many of those minerals, which happens sometimes, then those excess minerals are taken by the osteoblast and used to produce new bone tissue. The four general shapes of bones, let's see, long, short, irregular, and flat. How would a bone's strength be affected if the ratio of collagen to calcium increased? Well, it would be more flexible and less, the strength would be less and the flexibility would be greater. A sample of a long bone shows concentric layers surrounding a central canal. Is it from the shaft or the end of the bone? It's definitely from the shaft because the shaft is composed of compact bone. And what is being described here, the concentric layers around a central canal, that's an osteon, and that's only found in compact bone. Number 5, mature bone cells are known as osteocytes. Bone building cells are osteoblasts, and osteoclasts are bone resorbing cells. Number 6, if the activity of osteoclast exceeds that of osteoblast in a bone, how will the mass of the bone be affected? Osteoclasts are going to break down bones, so that's